with Streett. I'll be talking to you about co-evolving some neural networks. So thank you all for coming or accidentally wandering in. Either way, I'm happy to have you. So first of all, how did we come to this? So we observed in the lab differences of zebrafish behavior from domesticated and wild populations. So we really wanted to tell what the difference was. And so testing these hypotheses empirically were very challenging. Even though it's a great model system, testing these would be difficult. So we decided to use evolutionary computation and neural networks to actually mitigate these restraints and to test these. So what's happening here? So this is after using evolutionary computation to evolve neural networks. The black dot is a predator, and the red are the prey. The line that's going to the red dots is actually the sensing, so what it is picking up. The black circle around it is the sensing radius, so everything it can see, and then the line behind it is a swim track. So on the right-hand side, we have a neural network, and all the neural network is what it can know and what it can do. Somewhere in there. And the genomes, or the weights, determines how it takes what it knows into what it can do. So what we did, instead of keeping food stationary, oh, darn it, messed that one up, sorry. It's in a little bit, don't worry. So as we can see, it evolves to optimize to collect food. So all the lines are different populations and replicates. The x-axis is generations, and the y-axis is average food consumed. And we can see it optimizes its neural network to actually collect all the food. What the neural network does, we're going to focus here on the x to x and y to y. X to x means that it either goes toward food or goes away from food. So if it had a negative value, x to x, it would go away from food. But intuitively, it needs to go toward the food to collect it. Same with y to y. Down here are drift genes, so they have no effect on fitness. So we can use these to statistically test if there is actually selection happening. This x input to y input, this x to y and y to x, that's a really interesting story, but as far as time constraints go, we are going to ignore it. And the bias node to x and bias node to y, what that is essentially with no input, what do you do? And it makes sense that they would stay still. So, this is what I jumped to earlier. We thought it would be cool if we put in a neural network in the prey so they could actually react. So the food, or the prey, has a neural network of its own of the same topology. So what that means is it's the same inputs and it's the same outputs. The fitness of the prey is based upon survival time. And for each generation, there's 100 predators and 1,000 prey. And for each of the treatments I'm going to talk about, there were 25 replicates. So to actually test if coevolution is happening, we had 3 different treatments. So one, prey had drift and predators had selection. So what that means is all the prey, no matter what they did, got one gamete to reproduce with. In the second treatment, we had selection on the prey and drift on the predators. And on the third treatment, we actually let coevolution happen and there's selection on both. So the first one is drift with the prey and selection with the predation. And as we can see, they optimize their food collected. Each of the color lines, again, is a population, and there's 25 of them. The x-axis is a generation, and the total food consumed is on the y-axis. And just watching it visually, you can see they get pretty good at collecting the food. The predator neural network, as expected, this x to x and y to y are still positively selected upon. The bias node is a bit more noisy than in the stationary case, and drift looks as we expect. The predator neural network, though, is pretty much just drift, right? So as expected, it drifts, and there's no selection gradients detectable. Our next one was we selected upon prey, and the predation drifted. And as we can see, overall, the food collected was much less. The predator neural network, as expected, just drifts around. There's no detection seen. And the prey neural network, X to X and Y to Y, are highly negatively selected upon. This means that they run away from the food. The bias X and the bias Y are fairly stabilized in selection near 0. And again, X to Y and Y to X, there's an interesting story there, but I don't have time. You can talk to me after the talk. Lastly, we allow them to co-evolve. So we see that the food is in a more intermediate spot, and that the predators and prey are actually sort of chasing each other. The neural network for the predator, surprisingly, is actually quite a bit noisier than we would expect. So we have quite a bit of noise in the bias to X and the bias to Y. And X to Y, though there is a slight signal of positive directional selection, it's not much. And then drift is how we expect. And yeah, I'll just let the little video finish. The prey neural network, we see strong stabilizing selection at 0 for the bias node to X and the bias node to Y. And we see very negative selection on X input to delta X and Y input to delta Y. And again, really cool story here, but can't talk about it. So the first thing we noticed is that with coevolution happening, the fitness for the prey kept on evolving. So the blue line is the averages of all the 25 replicates, and it is much lower than the red line with allowing coevolution to happen. We see it is statistically significant, and that the effects are actually quite drastic. And the really cool thing is, even with this very simple neural network, we actually saw 2 different strategies evolve within the population of the predation. So on the left-hand side, we saw individuals that just went into the corner, which actually didn't make much sense until we looked at it in the context of a population. So on the right-hand side, this one playing, there we go. On the right-hand side, we see predators just hanging out in the corners, and other prey actually chasing them up to it, and then collecting and gaining fitness from that, which is actually a really great strategy. Those corner dwellers actually account for 10% of the food collected, just from staying there and not having a very optimized neural network. However, these 2 strategies are not necessarily compatible. So if one gamete was from a parent of a chaser, and the other gamete was from a gamete of the corner dweller, it gets stuck in this. So one gamete is trying to track the food, while the other gamete is trying to get on a constant offset and go into the other corner. So it was actually really interesting to see that the hybrids being less fit than the parents. And so the conclusion is, when preys and predators neural networks could co-evolve, that actually, even with the simplest case, that 2 different strategies appeared, even just with a very basic neural network. Additionally, we observed higher rates of evolution in the prey neural network. So from a computational sense, this is actually super interesting. So how many of you heard about the Google Go bot that just beat like the world's grandmaster? So what happened is they did a deep learning algorithm to actually make an optimized topology, and then they put it against itself to actually learn and optimize those weights. However, they could have thought about that in a coevolutionary standpoint, where there's limited resources and competition, with wins and loses being the resources. Additionally, they're already doing coevolutions on very practical applications, such as antivirus and computer virus software development. So essentially co-evolving feature selection and weights to detect viruses on computers. So what if we thought of these as populations of antiviruses and viruses to optimize that and offer better protection for computers? Lastly, they're evolving first-person shooter game bots, which I think would be awesome to have a population of, I don't know, maybe say red versus blue players, and actually evolve them to be optimized and find different strategies and be better than the current evolutionary computation approaches. So perhaps maybe instead of Halo Combat evolved, it's Halo Combat co-evolved. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I would also like to thank the Computational Resource Corps. They let me use all their computers, and it was great. So thank you. Is there any questions? Yeah.
What was the prey input?
So the prey neural network was the exact same as the predation. So on that first slide, it was the x to the nearest predation and the y to the nearest predation. So it was the exact same neural network.
Just 0.
Yeah, so there was some pretty cool correlations between fitness.
But the prey can't see each other.
Yeah, so there's no input on like your nearest buddy. So yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, so how do you explain the prey clustering, or also the preys that would just kind of stay in the middle and then become stationary?
Yeah, so they would optimize so heavily that they essentially almost became a clonal population. So they would react the exact same way to the exact same inputs.
Okay.
And so that's why the bias nodes were stabilizing at 0, because if you don't want to get eaten, it's a very bad strategy to like go around and allow that input to be seen. So, any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, so that was one thing we did. We actually took out boundaries, so there was no boundaries. And we actually saw that predation sort of evolved that competition, right? So it was sort of a arms race, and they evolved stronger weights. So they looked more like the prey, except opposite. So yeah, it was pretty interesting.